Good afternoon, Richard.
Afternoon, Tom. Thanks for having me.
This is my pleasure, I'm really anxious to hear more about how search companies are working with clients. That's something a lot of us don't always get a chance to see, and so I think your insights here would be very helpful. And it would be very helpful if you could talk about at some point, kind of what your ideal client looks like. I don't imagine every client is 100% easy to work with. Some are better than others. And the other one is, probably some discussion about how you handle the confidentiality, whether or not you have non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements or whatever else. Because if you're really being engaged with a client, there's probably a lot of business and personal information that gets shared that shouldn't get shared beyond whatever the compact is between the client and the provider. So, with that as a background, tell us a little bit about what it is that you guys do and what your major challenges are and how you overcome those.
Sure. Jackson Grant is a recruitment and executive search firm. So we work from mid to senior level, all the way up to C level or regional,
Uh-huh.
based out of Bangkok in Thailand. We specialize in industrial manufacturing, engineering, and supply chains. So
Okay.
that tends to be the field that we focus on, and in particular areas like automotive, electronics, could be FMCG, logistics industry. So those are the core.
Okay.
I've been in Bangkok about 15 years now,
Hmm.
and I founded the company about 12 years ago. We are also the representative for the Cornerstone International Group, which is a
Okay.
Forbes Top 20 international executive search group.
Right.
And we've been the representatives for them in Thailand since 2015.
Oh, very good. Very good. All right. So, in terms of searches, most of your search is really aimed at the mid senior level positions.
Correct.
Okay. So could you kind of describe what the average engagement looks like? If how somebody contacts you and what happens?
Sure. I would say that almost all of our executive search work comes from referral business these days.
Okay.
We've developed a great reputation over the years for being one of the more consultative
Mhm.
businesses out there and one of the only specialists in our field. Thailand's a manufacturing hub where we're based.
Right.
It's a supply chain hub. So a lot of the time, clients are driven to us via referrals, via either the chambers of commerce,
Mhm.
our existing clients, or it could be that candidates that we've placed are now in executive positions and need
Right.
support for their businesses.
Okay. How helpful are the chambers?
The chambers are very helpful in terms of giving access, I would say, to some of the international brands here.
Mhm.
The events are very well attended, usually by senior decision makers.
Right.
That said, a lot of the roles that we work at the country level are placed or instructed by the bosses or the regional HRs who are not based in Thailand. So it's
Ah,
important for us to have a network outside. So areas like Singapore, Hong Kong, or Europe, America, these are where the biggest searches in Thailand will be originated from.
right. So a lot of us now are very concerned about the data privacy laws that have become a bigger and bigger feature, not only for employers but also search companies, testing companies, all of us become involved in these things. How has the data privacy legislation affected you?
Thailand launched it just before COVID. We were supposed to
Right.
go live with PDPA, and COVID delayed it. We had actually got ahead of planning, and we were compliant pre 2020. So it's really not been as impactful for us as some of the businesses that are trying to keep up.
Right.
We realize now that we've got to be very careful with client and candidate data. It can't use for purposes that haven't expressly given permission. CVs around, it shouldn't have been done anyway, but it
Right.
definitely is illegal now.
Right.
And you also in such a small market, I would say in multinationals in a developing market economy
Hmm.
in specific industries, there may be only a handful of candidates that are suitable for very senior roles
Right.
anyway. So the integrity of their career is in your hands.
Right.
You've got to take it very seriously. Certain steps that we've made, for instance, the introduction process, and we can do things like password protection
Right.
on the portals that we use. So instead of sending a resume, which is what we might have done 4 or 5 years ago, we actually send access to an online portal on our system,
Okay.
so that clients can review that data, but then they don't have a copy to pass around internally, which can be conflicted or get to eyes that are not supposed to be seeing it.
Right.
So again, we maintain the data. The data's been given permission for us to use it
Right.
expressly for that client, but we would never send it to anyone else, and the client doesn't have it to send on to anywhere either, or retain that data.
Okay. That reminds me of another question I wanted to ask you, but I'm thinking about it now, so I'm going to ask it now. Do you guys do reference checks
Oh,
on behalf
absolutely.
of clients?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Tell
Very
me a little
important
bit
part.
about that process.
I mean, for me, there's a couple of areas of executive search that really haven't evolved that much over the years.
Right.
One is around offers and negotiations, and the second is reference checking.
Right.
Especially these days when it's very, let's say, finding and identifying candidates is easier than ever before. They aren't hidden in the jungle anywhere. They're generally either in an active community
Right.
in your
Right.
network, or they have an online presence. Um, Getting a validation from someone that's actually seen them at work, and potentially has worked with them, managed them, or been managed by them, or been a customer or a supplier for them for a number of years, is extremely powerful information
Right.
when you're trying to balance that up against what potentially might have been a handful of hours of interview with a selection of different stakeholders, many of whom may actually be repeating the same sort of questioning, or duplicating uh, you know uh, conversations.
Right.
So
Right.
again, there's a lot of speculation I see in interview processes that does go on, and if we can take that out and get some validation from professional references, not cheerleaders,
Right.
and
Right.
endorsers, I would
Right.
say, but
Right.
maybe and this is why when we go into reference checks, we do prefer to specify who we want the reference for,
Right.
rather than just ask the candidate to provide their best friend and their auntie as
Right. Right.
the endorsers. So somewhere
Antis
in
are
there's a
pretty
balance.
reliable, actually.
Well, it depends who your family is.
Right. So the other thing is, when you do a reference check, do you have to make sure that you have the candidates sign off that they've authorized you to do that, whether it's contacting a university or a prior employer?
Again, absolutely.
Okay.
Now we've had several instances of this recently, and I'll share an example. We had a very senior search on just recently for the vice president of his huge headcount business, and the key candidate, the primary candidate that we'd identified, had been at his current company for over 10 years, I think around 15 years, and the key client stakeholder was insisting to do a background check with his current company before we progressed with his candidacy. The issue was that one of the current leadership team had also worked at that business as well,
Oh,
and so we had to refuse to do that background check, because if there was any flags raised,
sure.
it would have been very awkward for the candidate.
Correct.
And in the end, we reached an impasse, and we refused to represent the candidate, and told the
Okay.
client that the candidate couldn't proceed. So that you again, you have to draw your lines, and ethically, I think we were 100% correct to do that.
And let me ask you this question because I know that sometimes, it's very difficult working. They're
Hmm.
coming to you as a candidate for a job, but they have a job.
Hmm.
So it becomes almost impossible to contact their current employer or yeah. So in that case, do you ever do tell the candidate, look, we're going to do a reference check, but if we make you the offer and you accept and you start here, we won't do the reference check until you've started.
You are relying somewhat on the EQ of the client to understand, when you've got
Right.
candidates who've had a significant tenure at their current business, that there is going to be some, let's say, there's going to need to be a little bit of flexibility in where the references are coming from. Um, Generally, at senior executive level, the boss or a former boss will have probably either been retired or moved on
True.
at this level, so that could be less problematic. But if they're expecting, let's say, a direct reference for a step up, into a role when they've been working with a stable MD for 3 or 4 years, they're not going to be able to reference their capability at their
Sure.
current job because they weren't doing it when they worked together.
Right.
So again, this is where references serve a purpose, but they're not the be all and end all.
Right. Right. And yet, ignoring those things can get you into trouble.
Absolutely. I mean, there's red flags to be done,
Right.
and a lot of reference checks are lip service, Tom. To be honest,
Right.
recruiters do them and then tick the box and then say, right, here, let's get the offer out and
Right.
let's get it all closed off, and that's the box ticked. So, the reference checks are designed to be probing. You need to go into depth. Now, we can still do that. In Thailand, elsewhere, I know that in the US and the UK, for instance, reference checks are far less, I'd say, inquiring than we can do here. We are probably moving towards that but again, reference checks can serve a purpose, and candidates shouldn't be afraid to divulge that information.
One of the people that we talked to when we were doing research we look at candidate provided information, and one of the pieces of research that we found is that about one third of the information that's provided by a candidate,
Hmm.
either in a resume or a CV, and not every candidate, but about one third of the candidate provided information is inaccurate,
Mhm.
to be kind. Some of it's an outright lie. So, and then you pick up the Wall Street Journal or Forbes magazine or one of the major business publications, and every year they will publish some infamous story about somebody who was in a senior executive role, and a year later, the company let them go because they falsified information on there. And of course, if you're running for U.S. Congress, that's not a problem, apparently. But if you're working in the corporate world, that can lead to immediate dismissal. So there it does happen. It happens far more than people would think.
Sure.
And so I think the reference check, even though it's problematic, one of the suggestions that we got was after the interviews are done, and then you go back to verify what they told you specifically. So in that case, there's likely more ability to get the reference check, the referee to say, yes, they did that, or no, they didn't do that.
Yeah. Look, I think this is where it comes down to selecting an executive search partner that does have a degree of industry
Right.
expertise. If you're going to generics or maybe people that don't have a depth of
Hmm.
expertise in a particular industry, that can happen. I mean, I can tell you now, there's industries that we work in where the resume looks perfect, but we know the skeletons in the closet on some of these candidates,
Right.
and clients will come to us and say, well, look, can we consider this candidate? And we've got to be a little bit cautious with sharing information.
Hmm.
We kind of rely on them to trust us to say, look, we know there's some potential red flags around
Right.
this candidate
Right.
that you're going to have to trust us because we can't share the confidential information we may be party to, and this is where we do act somewhat as I guess an advisor and a bit of a confidant
Right.
to the client as much as just identifying
Right.
candidates.
But it does put you in kind of an awkward situation
Oh,
sometimes.
yeah, completely. And again, I keep going back to, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, the partnership aspect of
Right.
executive search. There are, I mean, these are people's careers,
Yes.
and we have to treat the candidate's career as seriously as any other factor in the process. It's got to be the right move for them. It's got to be a good fit. It's got to be, we know, and that's got to be in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time,
Right.
not just today.
Right.
Um, these things come out in the wash. So if you're doing your job properly, you should, be ensuring these things up front, not just trying to make that placement.
Right. The other thing that sometimes happens with some employers, not all, but fortunately not very many of them, but they can be quite arrogant towards a candidate. In other words, they feel like, well, this is, we've got this position and you're the one who's interested in working for us, but we don't always get the people who are doing the hiring decision to be respectful and kind and everything else to the candidates, and they sometimes forget the candidates have choices too,
No,
right?
correct. Yeah.
And so the candidate, during the process of the interview, there are two decisions that are being made. Number one, is this a candidate that we want to hire? And number two, is this a company I want to work for?
Yeah. It's a two-way street.
It is a two-way street. How much time do you actually wind up having to spend uh, getting that point across to clients?
I think I'm going to put this on the doorstep of a lot of executive search consultants as well.
Okay.
A lot of them have stepped up from recruitment
Uh huh.
and a similar sort of process, but with a bigger bill on the end.
Right.
And the whole process is completely different. A lot of the time with recruitment, it's seen as a bit of a test. There might be other agencies involved. It's a
Hmm.
matter of speed or just finding a candidate that can work in a position
Right.
pretty swiftly.
Right.
With executive search, it's the emphasis should never be on speed. It should
Hmm.
always be on the right fit, the quality, and longevity. And consultants that don't probe enough to make sure they're going to be going into a partnership situation. Um, this is executive search is not a test of your capability. You should be proven before you come in the door.
Hmm.
Okay, so when you start these searches, really understanding the difference between the searches and the search process is one thing. So the other could be said for HR as well.
Right.
Many HRs that we work with maybe haven't supported this level of search before. And as such, they maybe copy and paste a template or what they've done from
Right.
previous recruitment
Right.
searches. The typical scenario, which can let's say burn a candidate at this level. Let's say we've got a senior executive looking for a move. Um, our typical process would be that they would come and speak to. We would identify them first of all. They would do a triage with one of our research team, just to tick a couple of boxes, make sure we're
Hmm.
not wasting anybody's time.
Right.
They would then do an in-depth interview with me, maybe even two interviews with me. They then go to the client. If the client then decides that they're going to go back through two more interviews of HR, from the candidate's perspective, they've now had 4 to 5 hours potentially of
Right.
speaking to HR people, the recruit at this level. They're engaged in a couple of things. One is, why am I coming here? Who's my boss going to be?
Exactly.
This is going to be the person that I'm going to be spending really most of my accountability with. And the third is, who are my team?
Hmm.
What is my team capable? Is it a firefight? Is it a rebuild? Have I got the
Right.
resources to do it? And so you do need to get a little bit more. It's definitely not a rubber stamp. The hiring manager needs to get involved maybe slightly earlier in that process,
Hmm.
and to really be sharing. Because now, in that said, if you can get a strategic and senior enough HR stakeholder involved and very involved in this process
Right.
at the very first level, that's a great indication that the business is working
Okay. All right. So the other question I was going to ask is, and you kind of alluded to this, there is a partnership that you strategic partnership that you take on. How many candidate or how many clients do you work with who say to you, "We're going to fill this position. We got a CFO's job." As you are out there in the marketplace, you kind of know the people that are going to fit within our organization. We may or may not have an opening
well.
right now, but if you run into people that you think would fit in our organization, would you come knock on my door and tell me about it?
Oh, clients are generally never shy to waste your time.
Right.
Let's put it that way. Look, you can't. You either engage or you don't. In my book,
Right.
if there's an opportunity, and again, I think this comes back to sometimes clients have an inability to commit to a decision. I see a lot of prevarication.
Hmm.
I mean, imagine in that scenario, we do go and knock on the door. We get an engaged candidate. He goes into the process, or she goes into the process. They interview, and then the client changes their mind.
Right.
Okay? This has just been a waste of everybody's time, and it's not good for the candidate, for the client's reputation.
True.
It burns our rep with the candidate as well. And again, there's a lot of negativity as a result of that process. It's one of the reasons why when you talk about executive search, for me, it's 100% engagement.
Right.
The, that at least is a commitment to the consultant that even if there is no placement at the end of the rainbow, there's a certain amount of time that's been compensated. They're going to do a professional job on that basis. Um, I don't know the executive search consultant that would take a brief like that and actually go and work that. To be honest,
Okay.
that sounds more like a mid-level recruitment contingency type
Okay.
scenario. And in all honesty, if I was on the candidate side and a consultant approached me at that level for a job and told me I wasn't engaged and there might be a job, I'd laugh them out the room.
Hmm. Okay. So the other question I wanted to ask you is, what kind of how many clients expect a guarantee
In terms of performance or
in terms of performance? We're going to extend the offer to this person. If they leave in less than a year, they leave in less than 6 months.
uh,
You'll
yeah, it's a given in our industry. It's
okay.
it's a given. So most executive search you'll provide a 12-month guarantee. So if the
Okay.
candidate doesn't work out, or if the candidate is maybe decides to leave for whatever reason, then you would replace the candidate.
Okay. So we talked about guarantees with candidates, and kind of what you do with that. So there must be an awful lot of discussion that goes on. What how do you engage with a client, and where does it start and where does it end? Is there a defined end to it, or is it an ongoing relationship, or what happens?
I mean, the best consultant is going to try and cultivate a cyclical relationship. You get a brief, you work the assignment, you close the mandate, you nurture the candidate
Hmm.
through the whole onboarding and the tenure, and then hopefully you pick up more work as a consequence. So it should be an ongoing relationship. I mean, the other thing as well is that in executive search, we're not talking about volume, we're talking about quality.
Right.
And finding quality clients is very difficult. So
Right.
if you've got them, you want to wrap them in cotton wool. You do want to be in regular contact with them, both on the candidate side and the client side to check touch points. We do act a lot, as I've said, about as a confidant. So there
Hmm.
can be let's say 6 months down the road, the candidate is saying, well, this isn't exactly what I signed up for.
Right.
It might not be a issue, but they can use us as
Disconnect
a
of some kind.
yeah, and or maybe the role has slightly changed, or
Right.
maybe the boss that they signed up for has moved on or been transferred.
Hmm.
So again, there's these little touch points where it's not terminal, but they can use us as a confidant to get this information back. Because generally in their business, they may not yet have that
Have the
senior
connections.
stakeholder that they
Right.
can go to, but it might be that I do because I've got the historic relationship with the people that engage me in
Right.
the first place.
Right.
So
Right.
that is a critical role for an executive search consultant as well to really help retain that talent if they do have little concerns moving down
Right.
the road.
One of the things we've talked about all the way through these podcasts is the importance of the interview, the structured interview, and for a couple of different reasons. One of which is it gives the candidate a chance to meet the people, and you alluded to this before, who they're going to be working with.
Mm.
Are these people that I know, trust, like, feel like I could be part of the team? And of course, the team is trying to decide, is this person going to come in and fit the role and help us? So when you look at the client organizations, do you ever get a chance to come in and observe their interviewing process and see what's happening, so you can kind of either explain to the candidate how you consider doing these things?
Some clients are terrified to have us in the process.
Hmm.
Without trying to sound arrogant, we do this professionally. We do it all the time. So
Right.
we've probably done a lot more of it than a lot of the clients have,
Correct.
especially at this level, and it makes us good at what we do.
Right.
Um, Again, going back to whether it's a structured or a semi-structured interview, depending on the seniority of the candidates, we will be open to be in those interviews for sure. It's definitely something that gives us the ability to very quickly feedback. Um, the other thing as well is that just the in terms of the feedback loop, if we're not witnessing the interview directly, getting a professional, laid out, and in-depth reason why, or feedback as to how they've come to the conclusion. This is what I find is very difficult.
Uh-huh.
Generally, senior HR or senior stakeholders that are interviewing these candidates are very, very busy people, and this is a part of their work. For us, it's 100% of our work.
Right.
So we can provide in-depth candidate reports, analysis, assessment, and generally recommendations. Whereas a senior stakeholder could be finishing that interview and then running off to a budget meeting or a marketing update or something, and we get a. And this is again going back to candidate experience, which is a huge. It really is a focus. As we said, it's a two-way street now.
Right.
Candidate experience has to be on point. And I would really urge stakeholders in the interview process to be giving themselves time to give professional feedback. And that generally doesn't mean 5 minutes after the interview finished.
Right.
At this level, there's a little bit of maybe fermentation, and again, unstructured interviews are one of the worst for this.
Right.
A lot of people come down, they'll sit down, they'll have that coffee chit chat style. They'll generally cover bulk of what's been covered by other interviewers already. And then there's 2 or 3 pertinent questions and a decision needs to be made.
Right.
And again, that's just not good enough.
No, of course not. Of course not. No, the research that we've done says that if you look at what builds a credible selection process, regardless of the level of the candidate, is number one, structured interviews. More important than personality, cognitive ability, reference checks, it's a structured interview. So if those things are not being done, you're losing the bulk of your predictability of assessing the candidate.
Right. And again, it's important to get that chemistry and to maybe break the ice a little bit. But if you've had that icebreaker with the researcher,
Right.
then with the executive search consultant, and then again with HR, and now you're in the 4th interview and you're talking again about your family background or how you got to this point in your career, you're sort of thinking, well, are these guys communicating? Is there any, this is disorganized. This is what I'm walking into.
Right.
So again, I think having a very clear I mean, we haven't mentioned the word communication yet, but again, I'm going to push this back to executive search consultants. Just on the basis of a 45-minute intro conversation, probing different areas, motivations key, engagement key. Why are they talking to us? Why, what are they just waiting for that big offer?
Do you find that the clients will give you a list of the criteria that they're evaluating the candidate by? Do they share that with you?
Some clients are pretty sophisticated like that,
Right.
And they will share it, but they won't necessarily share how they measure it compared to what we do. So they
Go fish.
well, exactly, and they may have a personality assessment or an MBTI
Right.
or something,
Right.
and that's how they're measuring it.
Right.
So it's very scientific and it's very measured, but they expect us to measure the same thing. Okay, so that's one thing. In terms of what they're measuring, I like it when we have some good company values to measure up against. But to
Right.
be honest, most companies don't really have a very unique set of values. I would say a lot of them have innovation, integrity. I mean, we're not going to propose, candidates without integrity. It's kind of given, right? So, and again, innovation. Let's talk about that. I mean, if you're a tech business, innovation means one thing. If you're a pharmaceuticals business, what does innovation mean to you?
Right.
If you're an electronics tier 3 manufacturer, what is innovation for you? So again, it's putting things in context as well.
One question I wanted to ask you, because we got to wrap up pretty soon, is how do you guys recommend that you're involved in the communication, the formulation and communication of the offer?
Okay, in terms of offer, we generally will want to make that offer.
Okay.
It's still a bit of a grey area.
Right.
Again, going back to what I said at the beginning of the conversation, it's one of the areas that really hasn't progressed in the course of executive search.
Right.
But one of the things I think is emerging is the positioning of the candidate is far stronger than it's ever been. Okay. My particular philosophy on this is that when we go into a search, a client has allocated a budget.
Right.
That budget is reflective of the role, the responsibility, and it's been pre-approved.
Right.
Okay. We will then go to search for candidates that will be happy to accept an offer in that budget range.
Right.
Now, if we find a particular superstar that might be over, we will of course ask up front if there's parameter, for a extra 15% or 20%. If we get that, absolute
Right.
superstar, can we consider them? If the client says no, the budget's the budget, fine, off the table. Right. If we get through the process and then at the end of it, there is a low ball offer, or there's okay, we've managed to find a candidate maybe under the budget. Obviously, they're expecting a bit of incentive to move. It is an absolute killer when we get low ball offers based on what they're
Right.
currently on rather than what the role grants.
Absolutely.
Okay? It might even be
Of
line,
course.
because your hierarchy and your comp structure
Of course.
is going to be a cascade,
Right.
and it's going to put pressure on every niche below that, and eventually it's going to end up with either the new executive walking in demanding a huge pay rise,
Right.
or you won't be able to hire the talent that you need throughout the organization.
There you go. Couldn't agree more. Okay, Richard, listen, thank you very much. I think your perspectives and insights have been very valuable, and I hope our audience appreciates.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Okay.